Hello everyone, Byron here. In this video we're going to be painting this Daemonettes of Slaanesh, so let's get cracking. After priming the miniature with a black undercoat, I begin by base coating the mini with a combination of Tenebrous grey and deep purple from AK Interactive. I paint this all over the miniature wherever I either have skin or hair. This is a nice dark purple and will give us a good base to work from. I repeated the base color a few times in order to get a nice solid base coat, and from this we proceed to the next. Once the base coat is completed, I start to work on the first initial base layer for the skin. For this I add a little bit of vampire flesh from AK Interactive to the previous grey and purple mix. Here, as you can see, I'm basically covering all areas that would be flesh of the miniature, with only leaving the initial base coat in the deep recesses to add a little bit of darkness and contrast. And this is what the mini will look like after this stage, where mainly you have the color all over except in the recess. For the next step, I add a little more vampiric flesh to the previous mix, so by lightening the color, and this I once again apply mainly on the areas trying to start to define the muscles, as you can see I'm working here. So basically where the light would hit each piece, and trying to just leave a little bit of the previous layer behind in order to start building up a bit of a gradient. So after this stage, you can see that the skin is starting to get a bit lighter and we're starting to get a little bit of definition in the piece. For the next stage, we add additionally more vampire flesh to the previous mix, and we start now picking out the muscles more deliberately, trying to paint in a way that reflects the light that would be catching them, and starting to leave a bit of shadow in the spaces to give them a little bit more definition. And as you can see at this stage, the muscles are really starting to get a little bit of form, and you're starting to see where the light will be catching them in. The next stage is a repeat of the previous stage. We're just adding more vampiric flesh each time, and we're just lightening those muscles, but each time leaving a little bit of the previous colors behind. So you're starting to get this nice gradient, and we're building up the volumes of the individual muscle areas on the miniature. And after the stage, you can see that the muscles are really starting to get a bit of definition, and also seeing where the light is catching. So I continued repeating this process for 2 further stages, each time making the highlights progressively smaller and just trying to really work on that definition. So when you're painting this miniature yourself, if you're following this guide, you need to decide for yourself how much definition and how much kind of coloring you want to do as you go along, and then kind of select the amount of steps you want to do. So we've got this step, and then we've got one further step where I'm still using the same color mix, just adding an additional vampiric flesh, and after that we'll get to the final highlight. So this is the final stage where I add the last bit of vampiric flesh. So this mix is almost pure vampiric flesh with just a little bit of deep purple and Tenebrous grey, and it's just really at the top where the light would catch the muscle mass at its height. And there you have it. This is how the miniature looks before the final highlight. So for the final stage of painting the skin, all I use is vampiric flesh, and I'm just kind of doing a dot highlight right on the tip of the tail and those little segments that separate each thing, just to add a little bit of definition, or kind of right at the top of a muscle where the light will catch right at the edge, just to finish the process off. And that's really how I approach the skin. So I'm only using 3 colors, and I just keep slowly adding the vampiric flesh until we get to pure vampiric flesh at the end. So once the skin is completed, I'm now moving on to painting the hair and the robes. For this step, I'm basically painting deep purple over most of these areas, just leaving the dark initial Tenebrous grey deep purple mix that we did in the first step in the recesses. And this is kind of what the mini is going to look like after this stage, where you can see that the purple is starting to come through, but you've still got a lot of the shadow in the recess. For the next step, I do a 50-50 deep purple magenta mix. This is painted mostly on the hair as well as the fabric, and just leaving a little bit of the previous mix. But now I'm trying to pick out each of the individual hair strands with this mix in order to give it just a better look and feel. For the next step, I'm just using pure magenta, but I'm kind of focusing on where the light would catch the hair, so more on the tips, and kind of in the middle areas in order to give additional contrast and leaving the previous layers behind. For the final highlight, I do a 50-50 mix of the magenta with the vampire flesh. This gives a nice light, bright magenta color, and this I use to kind of pick out where the light will catch on the edges of the cloak, as well on the hair pieces as we go along, kind of where the light will catch the most. This gives a nice definition and kind of picks each strand of hair out. And this is what the mini will look like after this stage is completed. Okay, the next step we work on the claws. For this I had a 50-50 mix of Tenebrous Grey and Dirty Red from AK Interactive. I went for this color in order to give some contrast from the main mini, as well as harken back to that old school kind of red Daemonette claws. For the next step I returned to the previous mix but added additional Dirty Red to it, so we're now about 2/3 Dirty Red, 1/3 Tenebrous Grey. We paint over most of the claws, just leaving the original mix in the dark recesses. And this is what it will look like at this point, where you've just got the shadows starting to form. For the next stage, what I've done basically is use mainly Dirty Red and just a little drop of Tenebrous Grey to kind of give us the last transition before the final highlight. And as you can see here, I'm really just kind of working on the edges, leaving lots of the previous color behind, and this is what that will look like. So for the next stage, I'm just using pure Dirty Red and kind of now focusing on where the light will catch the claws, so mainly from the top, and leaving the bottoms kind of more dark, and just really building out that volume and the definition of each individual element. And this is what that looks like over here. So for the final step, I add a little bit of the Vampiric flesh to the Dirty Red and kind of work this on the very tips of the claws and the spikes around it where the light would reflect the most. I also find when I use a color like Vampiric flesh in another part of the mini, if I use it to highlight or make another color lighter, it ties the mini all together, and this is where we are at this point so far. So for the next step, I'm basically picking out all the bones, claws, any protrusions that I want to have a bone feel. And for this, I start with the base coat of Zandri dust, and I pick out all the areas which are going to be this bony color. From there, then I do a 50-50 mix of Zandri dust and Ushabti bone, and this I'm kind of painting 75% of the original things that I picked out in order to start giving them a bit of a highlight. And then finally, I just finish off with a final highlight of some Ushabti bone just on the tips in order to just bring out the details. And this is kind of the bone work completed for the miniature so far. So moving on to the next step, here I'm working on all the leather areas. So I've decided to do this as kind of a black leather. So this is on the corset and that leather strap on the leg that I was working on. For this color, I use Vallejo black, which I find is nice and matte. And from there, this is what it will look like. So for the next step, I do a 50-50 mix of Chaos Black and Neutral Grey. This is placed kind of where the light will be catching the mini, so like on the top of the corset areas, as well as the leather strap. But when you're busy with black, you want to leave quite a lot of dark black in the recess, so you're just kind of focusing on the light. Otherwise, it will look like you're just painting something that's grey. And this is what this stage will look like once complete. So for the next step, I used the pure neutral grey, and there I'm just really kind of doing an edge highlight where the light will catch right at the tips of everything, leaving really most of it black, just a little bit of work on each area to kind of show where the light would be catching the model at that specific spot. And this is what it will look like after the stage is completed. For the final dot highlight, I use a little bit of the neutral grey mixed with light grey, and this is really done just on the tips to kind of make the leather look a bit shiny where those kind of final highlights hit. And this is what the leather will look like once it's completed. So the final step on the mini is to paint the non-metallic metal gold elements. For this I start with Hull Red. Now with painting non-metallic gold, especially like a speed version like this, I find it useful to find an image. That's what I've got here to show me where the darks and the lights are for when I'm painting. So the first step was to paint an undercoat Hull Red, which we've got here. From there, then I use the ivory to really get the brightest part of the highlights going. So using the image as a reference, we're kind of doing the top right side in this case and kind of working on each element as we go along. So that's for the ivory, and this is what that looks like when it's finished. So with the ivory, you're trying to catch where the light will be the strongest on the item. Moving on from the ivory, we then use sand yellow from AK Interactive, and this is kind of the midpoint color in between the really dark Hull Red and the ivory, and this is kind of painted in order to join the two colors together, and this is what it will look like when completed. For the final step, I use Sahara yellow, and I paint this next to the yellow sand, and this gives me a transition between the dark of the Hull Red and the slightly lighter yellow sand that was done earlier. And then this is basically painted over, and what you land up having is a very kind of basic, simple yellowy gold non-metallic metal, which you can see now. So there we have it. The Daemonettes is finished. It's a really nice tabletop standard. It took me about an hour and a half, so within a week painting every night you could finish a unit in this kind of style. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you have a really great rest of the day, and I'll see you soon with the next video. All the best. Keep well. Cheers.